Hello, welcome to Game Worms. This is Brian Triel, and today I'm just here to talk briefly about the Embers of the Imperium, which is a new tabletop role-playing game that is being released by Fantasy Flight, the creators of Twilight Imperium 4. It's due to come out this summer. Not a whole lot has been released yet. There's not a specific date, and I haven't been able to find at least any previews of it. But what we do know about it mechanically is that it's probably based on the Genesis gaming system. And I feel like I'm going to need to backtrack a little and explain what that is. If any of you are unfamiliar with the concept of tabletop role-playing games, those are games in which one person represents like a storyteller or a narrator. And they govern, there's like a world that they've either created or they're using that somebody else has created. And they're describing events and people. Each player has a character, typically that they've created, who is a character, like a main character in that story. And so what the game master will do is kind of explain what's going on in the world. And then the players all work together to react to it. And they'll decide what their characters are going to do. And then they'll roll dice to see if they're successful. So let's say, for example, that the players are playing a troop of spies and they need to break into a fortification, and they can decide, okay, well, are we going to try to go up to the guards and bluff our way through? Are we going to try to climb over the walls? Are we going to try to pick the lock? Are we just going to attack? And so they're going to work together to figure out what's our strategy, and then they're going to attempt it, and there will be, the Game Master will kind of tell them what opposition they come up against, and they'll roll dice to see if they succeed or not. So that's role-playing games in general. This one, the most famous one, is Dungeons and Dragons, and this one, it's based on a D20 system. If you've seen all the fancy dice for Dungeons and Dragons, it's basically 4-sided dice up to 20-sided dice, and they'll have numbers on them. The Embers of the Imperium will be based on the Genesis gaming system, which would make sense because the Star Wars Edge of the Empire is based on that system, and it's also Fantasy Flight. So I'm pretty sure that mechanically, Embers of the Imperium should be very similar. But again, I haven't found any previews yet or anything of it, so it can't be 100% sure. But I would imagine it's going to be similar in play style to Edge of the Empire. So, lore-wise, what is Embers of the Imperium? So, Twilight Imperium 4, I've always thought was actually the perfect setting for a role-playing game because it's very lore-rich. It's a very large universe, so there's just tons of different planets and environments and ships and things like that you could use, and as well as just tons of alien races and factions that you could participate in. So it's always been, I thought, the perfect setting for an exercise like this. So what I've been able to find, so in the previous Codex release, there's so much backtracking I need to do. So since the release of Twilight Imperium 4, there have been 2 codexes released. And what these codexes are, is they'll provide things like new action cards or card updates or things like that for players that you can kind of just print yourself and put in your game. So let's say they reword one of the action cards or they think of another one or something like that, right? So these codexes will just contain information you can use to update your game. But in the most recent codex, they also had an announcement of a release this summer of Embers of the Imperium, the role-playing game, and they briefly describe the setting. They don't go a lot into it, but what it is that the Galactic Council, which is made of all these different warring factions, have become alerted that the Mahact gene sorcerers have been awakened and represent a pan-galactic threat. And so the Galactic Council has decided to form a special group to combat the Mahact as well as other, pan-galactic threats. So it's kind of just you have all these not necessarily unified factions that have kind of come together for this one greater problem to deal with it. So they've created this, as far as I can tell, secret group of Kaliris. I actually don't know how to pronounce it. Kaliris. I'm going to say Kaliris because I think it sounds better. And they're just agents that can kind of work behind the scenes. They can be spies, ambassadors, assassins, whatever. And they're kind of given run to do whatever they need to do. So, you might need to assassinate a president on a planet or something. The Galactic Council said, you do what you need to do to protect our galaxy. And they're all kind of pledged to help you, but they don't always necessarily want to give you their best gear. So, they give you a little base, apparently, on Mechatol Rex, the planet where the Galactic Council is. So, I think this was a really good strategy on a setup because it does allow for the players to come from a variety of otherwise warring factions where you wouldn't have characters naturally hanging out together. But I don't see any reason why, if you wanted to, you just couldn't play a band of rogues or freelancers as well. I'm sure that the setting would allow for that. But the way it's being presented is that you're a group of agents working for the Galactic Council. So I think that's pretty exciting. And I've actually been waiting for something like this to come out for a long time. So what I've decided to do, hopefully, this summer, if you've watched any of my videos, you know that technically I'm not exactly a master of filming and recording and lighting and stuff like that. So I'm working on it. But I do want to do kind of like a Critical Role sort of a show. I want to do a thing where I game master, some friends and stuff using this new system. So a couple just things I want to talk about the system, how it might compare to what you're more familiar with. So if you've seen Critical Role or you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, I just want to go through what a couple of the major differences are between the Genesis system and the D20 system. Number one is the dice. So both games will use polyhedral dice, or dice that have kind of not your normal 6-sided dice. D&D uses a lot more of them, although it's focused on the 20-sided die. And they're what you would call a binary dice system. So let's say in Dungeons and Dragons, you're in a fight and you're fighting a monster and you roll your D20. You either hit or miss. There's a little bit of, like you could get a critical hit, but really that's just, it's a hit that does extra damage. Or if you're trying to pick a lock and you roll to see if you pick the lock, you typically, with a couple minor variations, you typically just succeed or fail, right? So it's generally binary. The Genesis system is a narrative dice system, so the dice are designed to create kind of a story out of each roll. And how that works is instead of being binary, it's a scaled system that has additional advantages and disadvantages added to the success or failure. So instead of rolling numbers, your dice roll symbols. And what happens is you compare these symbols, and some will cancel out. So let's say I rolled 3 successes and 2 failures. Then I have 1 success left over. And that will give me... so I've succeeded, but only barely. So like maybe I picked the lock, but I've damaged it to the point where I can't relock it. Something like that. Well, that might not be a good example. But you've succeeded, but without a lot of flair. The example I just gave would actually probably be a better example of advantages and disadvantages. So I could have that 1 success, but maybe I came up with 2 disadvantages on the roll. So I succeeded in picking the lock, but something bad also came of that. So in this case, I broke it, Or you could have vice versa, where you could fail at the task, but it also brings on some sort of benefit. So let's say you're in a combat and you're shooting your laser gun at somebody and you miss, but you rolled a lot of advantage. Well, maybe you hit a steam pipe behind him that starts, he has to move from his cover because all the steam's coming out at him and he has to run out into the open. So your friends get a better shot at him. So that sort of thing. So the dice you're rolling, the GM kind of has to be on his toes. Although there are tables where you can look at and it'd be like, okay, well, if I roll 2 advantage, I can make him take a setback die, which is like a disadvantage die for his next roll or something like that. But it does allow for a lot of creative storytelling in what would otherwise be just very simple rolls. So I actually really like the narrative dice system. It's a lot of fun. A little more work, I think. And then the other major difference, I would say, is how leveling works. So in Dungeons and Dragons, your character has a level. And every time you level up, you're going to get new abilities. And you'll get better at fighting and picking locks, whatever. So it's tied to your level. So in the Genesis system, you don't have levels. You get experience points. But what you do, instead of leveling, you actually just use those points to buy specific abilities. So you could spend a bunch of points to say, okay, my character just got stronger, or learned how to use computers better, or, you know, something like that. Or you could buy an ability like, oh, he's really good at dodging now. And you can actually buy abilities from any career path. So you're not restricted by your class or anything, like your job. You have like a specialty. It's cheaper to buy things in your specialty, but you can always buy from anywhere. Well, I'm sure there's exceptions, but for more or less, your class isn't restricting you to what abilities you can take. It's just making them cheaper if you take them in what your specialty is. So, well, a lot of good customization ability. So I think it should be very interesting. Obviously it's not going to be Critical Role, guys, but I think it'll be a lot of fun. It'll probably be a low budget, you know, set pieces and technology. But yeah, looking forward to giving it a try. Hopefully it works out. I'll probably post on here when I'm ready to go and when the book's released. All right, well, that's all I have to say today. So good evening and good gaming.